one of the other big hopes I have for this book is that it inspires more action in a way, to make this work better into the future. I feel like oftentimes, to circle back to where we started, with these sexy headlines, plant trees, don't plant trees, like it works, it doesn't work. People like black and white. The gray is a little scary. But I believe this work is important. I believe it will help make the planet more habitable into the future for a number of reasons, not just because of carbon. And that, by illuminating the complexities, we can kind of put values up and guardrails, if you will, that help guide this work into the future. And also that we are all tree keepers in some way.
Hey everyone, welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode, we're talking about tree planting. We're talking about the Trillion Tree Program and all these different ideas out there and all these different programs worldwide to plant a bunch of trees to help with the carbon crisis and help with climate change, that kind of thing. And if you're not aware, there's a lot of division in this idea. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of different perspectives, even in the scientific community, about what we should do, what we can do, what's possible, what's ethical, where do we plant these trees, how do we plant them, who's going to take care of them, what does their future look like? Do they stand forever or do we manage them? Do we do cultural burning in there? Do we do harvesting? Do we allow people to enjoy it? What do we do? So I brought on this wonderful person, Lauren Oakes. She wrote an incredibly well thought out, well researched, and well considered book called Tree Keepers: The Race for a Forested Future. Now, Lauren is a scientist and writer, and she's exploring the intersection of nature, climate, and human impacts through story. She has her PhD from the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program for Environment and Resources. She is an ecologist and a land change scientist, and she's just committed to facilitating more sustainable land use practices in communities across the world. It was this great conversation, an amazing book, all about this idea of planting trees. Should we plant more trees? Should we not plant more trees? If we do plant them, where do they go? What's our relationship to them? How do we manage them or steward them going into the future? Who's taking care of them? Right? There's a lot going on there, and Lauren really dived into it, and she knew a lot. So I really appreciated her expertise. The book was amazing. Definitely go check it out, called Tree Keepers. And sponsors for this episode. West Fraser is the number one sponsor. They've been with me almost since the very beginning. Thank you, West Fraser, for your support over the years. Couldn't do this without you. Also, Greenlink Forestry has been a sponsor since the beginning. Thank you, Greenlink. Now, let's get into this conversation all about planting trees for climate change and the race for a forested future. Here we go. First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I know you obviously put in a lot of time into writing this book and traveled the world to do it and to try and get the message right, I suppose, is the right way to put it. And like, obviously you've done exhaustive work on trying to be fair and trying to suss out where all the issues might lie, right? Before we get into it, I want to just get to know you a little bit. And I think kind of the best way to do that is just, what's your story and what started you down this Trees for Climate investigation?
Yeah, I'd say I've always had a fascination with trees and an appreciation for them. I grew up on the East Coast in the U.S. here, and my dad gave me an old Retina camera, like the kind you have the lens that folds out, very different than what we use today with our iPhones. But it was my grandfather's. And, the earliest contact sheets, which I still have, are filled with pictures of trees, the ones in our backyard. And, we had an old maple tree and there were other forested areas surrounding. And then I started to take pictures of the changing land use, as there was a housing community, a housing development that came in down the street from where I lived. And I remember photographing that. And I don't know what motivated me at the time, but to me, in looking back and, feeling that imprint on my life, it must have had some impression. The sense of growing up around trees, and then also the sense that they might change or we might lose them. I feel like a lot of people go on to college and say they think they know what they're going to study, and then they completely change directions
Big time.
in college. But, I went thinking I wanted to study environmental studies and art and storytelling, and that's what happened.
Nice.
Even at 18. And ever since then, I'd say, my career has taken me to forests and communities around the world, really taking a look at our stewardship of forests and how can we sustain these systems into the future. I'm trained as a scientist. I have a PhD from Stanford in an interdisciplinary environmental science program, but I really have found a love for storytelling. I feel like there's a lot of important research going on in the environmental world, addressing the biodiversity crisis, addressing climate change. And, a lot of times it's left to the media to find those stories or pick up that information. And I've really enjoyed sharing relevant science, relevant problem-solving research to address some of these world problems.
Yeah, that's awesome. It is fun to tell stories, isn't it? I like it's enjoyable to get it from the people's mouths and have them explain it and have them describe it. It provides so much more richness, and I get it. You can get into the nuance of things, right? So I can appreciate that.
Yeah, and I feel like it's been most of the writing that I do is a blend of reporting, talking to people, and interviewing, doing research myself. A lot of secondary research looking at articles on the topic of interest. And then, some also drawing from my firsthand experience as a scientist and ecologist.
Awesome. So what started you down the planting trees, planting forests for climate change, for carbon sequestration investigation? Obviously, it's a big topic. Lots of people, there's lots of humming and hawing about what to do. And what was the trigger for that you wanted to dedicate so much time towards planting trees for climate?
Yeah. The Tree Keepers is my second book, and it is fully reported. I feel like my first book, In Search of the Canary Tree, which came out in 2018, I lived myself into. It drew largely from my research in Alaska, where I was studying a tree species that was dying and is dying because of climate change. And I was looking at how people in those communities were coping and adapting to the changes occurring. And at that time, I felt like, I had done the research and I had done the science and I'd published in various journals, but, I had a personal journey through the research itself. I lived in and around forests with standing dead trees for many months of my life. And I felt like I was struggling with the question of how do we have hope and what is my outlook and what can I do to address climate change? So that book largely came from, a feeling like I could tell that story in a narrative, the way that science couldn't.
Yes.
And on the flip side, so in 2018 that came out, and I actually started thinking about this topic then. I had a couple colleagues at Stanford who were studying forest reversals. So this is where or forest transition. And this is essentially when you see a country that has gone from a deforestation trend to a reforestation, or at least an increase in forest cover.
Okay.
There are countries like China, Bhutan, Vietnam, Costa Rica are a few that were on my radar at that time. And I was thinking, well, could this happen in a hopeful way on a global scale? Fast forward, just a year or two later, and a lot of interest picked up in tree planting for a few reasons we can talk about.
Yeah.
But I think we've seen, tree planting become kind of a catch-all way to do something good for the planet.
Yeah.
If you open your Google and search, tree planting and climate or tree planting in the environment right now, you're going to get a ton of headlines. If you click on the little news button, and they kind of paint a controversy of trees are the climate solution. Trees are not the solution.
Yes.
The scientists are warning people we should be reducing our emissions. The headlines are, sexy and simple, I guess.
Yeah,
and
totally.
and I wanted to take a deeper dive into this question of to what extent can trees or forests really help combat the climate crisis, save us, if you will, and how. So that was my entry point. I was focused largely on carbon, but the story became about a lot more, and as we'll probably talk about today.
Yeah, clearly, absolutely, yeah, no, for sure. I think one of the most important things that hooked me early on in the book to make just to convince me that this is definitely a book that's been well researched and well discovered and is well thought out and is well considered was like right off the bat. Basically, you're saying this isn't really about trees, about planting trees. Realistically, it's about planting, conserving, and managing forests for the long term, right? And so I want to, so in your mind, just describe what is the difference between planting trees and planting forests?
Well, first, let's just talk about planting in general, because
Sure.
I think when we talk about planting, you're thinking of that simple act, right? And it is attractive. Like I can go down to the store and pick up a tree, or a donated program in my city where I'm given a tree and plant that. And there is a sense of feeling and accomplishment and care that comes from it, right? But whether or not that tree delivers the many benefits we might hope for from it, like be it carbon or be it shade or many other benefits we could discuss into the future, depends on its long-lived life. And that depends on our stewardship and our ability to keep the tree.
Yes.
So there is a little bit of a misperception that planting is one tiny, tiny piece of the puzzle. And the more I dug into this topic, I learned all about, the work involved in scaling up our seed collection and production to, it's incredible what's involved to, some programs need watering, need continual monitoring into the future. But really, at the heart of it all is you need a economic incentive or a personal incentive at the local level for the people living in and around those trees or those forests to sustain them.
Yeah.
And I guess to the second point, you asked like a tree or a forest. And that's, a chapter in the book, actually, what is a forest?
Yeah.
I write a little bit about my time in Suriname from many years ago. When I was in high school, I went to Suriname on a trip. I had been collecting medical supplies for the Albert Schweitzer Institute. We were delivering these medical supplies in orphanages and hospitals. And I remember snippets of my time there, but what I really remember is my time in the forests, because they were so incredibly diverse. I could look around and just see, more species than I could count, rich, organic soils and multi-layered plant life, and obviously a diversity of wildlife connected to that as well. But that, gave me an early impression of what a relatively pristine or intact or even primeval, old growth, whatever word you want to use, forest is.
Yeah.
And now, when we look at these efforts around the world to reforest or afforest, so if you're reforesting an area that was recently forested or has been in recent history. And if you're afforesting, you may be expanding forest into an area that, in the order of some number of years, usually 50, was not a forest.
Right.
But, it raises the question of what kinds of forests are we creating, and how do you define a forest? Can we strive for all our forests to be those, primeval, old growth ones that still remain? No, in reality, we're seeing a lot of different kinds of forests, be it the urban forest, a plantation for timber, a plantation for fast growing species that will sequester more carbon, even a native forest that we may be restoring. We're not restoring exactly to what it was before.
Right. Yeah. And that speaks to the need for, we also don't want just like all 1,000-year-old forests, because there's animals and habitats that require young forests. So you need the whole picture, right? You need that whole diversity of that structural diversity and age class diversity of everything. And we want, like you said, I think the best word to describe it is intact ecosystems, right? Rebuilding those ecosystems so they can go through their natural cycles of regeneration, whatever that may be. And I think that's what pulled me in right off the bat with your book was just that you're like, this isn't really about planting trees, but rebuilding ecosystems and building resilience. And I thought that was a huge point to make.
And I'd also say that it's about integrating trees and forests into our other land uses. I think there's a perception, like we all have these romantic visions of say like the redwoods on the California coast, or, some of the beautiful hardwood species in the Amazon and these kind of far off places, or like the intact forests in Suriname. But, more people come in contact in terms of sheer numbers on a daily basis with trees in our urban landscapes. And those trees are also providing benefits. I'd love to talk about some of the benefits they provide. Yes, they're having providing a service in terms of carbon sequestration, but also providing a lot of other community benefits as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I recorded a whole episode with American Forests on their
tree equity.
Yes, the tree equity.
Oh my gosh, so cool! Yeah,
I
think they're doing some really great work. So for those who haven't listened to that yet, tree equity is essentially looking at the equitable distribution of the benefits that come from trees. And, there have been studies linking, for example, a tree cover around schools to better test scores. Some studies have shown, healing rates in hospitals tend to improve if you have a view of nature, or perhaps, a forest out your window. There's cooling effects. One study I came across while I was researching just urban forestry was the shade effects, and particularly in a warming world, that's becoming more and more important. So in Portland, you can get a well-canopied neighborhood that's 20 degrees cooler in the summertime than one that doesn't have a lot of tree cover. And then obviously think about then the inequities tied to just that. Like if you're an older person living in that community, or you need to turn on your fan or air conditioning, you're taking on the economic burden of that. So while a lot of these relationships are correlations, and it is pretty hard to tease out the causation, you can see that tree cover is tied to a lot of other aspects and qualities of life that are important, well-being.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely. That was evident in that episode. And there was even, I think, early on here in Edmonton, the city did a whole, I'm not sure how they did it. It must have been remote sensing, but they created a whole inventory of all the boulevard trees, all the trees that the city technically owned, right? And you could go onto this website. I think it's still around. I think it's called YEG Trees, I think. YEG is the acronym for our airport, right? So YEG Trees. And I think it's still up, and you can go on there and you can go to a point, you click on a point, it'll tell you, oh, that's an American elm. It is, 53 years old. It has sequestered this much carbon. It has helped with the drain water this much. It has reduced the cost on the heating bill this much. And it has like all its stats. And then at the bottom, it has a described ecosystem services in dollar number. And I remember seeing one of the higher ones. And again, I don't know how they measured the ecosystem services, but they did it somehow. And it was in the tens of, I think it was $30,000 to $50,000 for like one mature American elm in the middle of the city. And it was, so like I think that was over the lifetime of the tree, but it just paints a picture of like, even if you're just a money person, trees do a lot. Even though all you care about is economy, it helps a lot. So even if you don't want to be romantic about it.
I've looked at a lot of maps of forests, and I think that American Forest Tree Equity map in the United States is an incredible resource. Like it's worth going to look and just poking around cities and areas. And you can also really see how it overlaps with low income areas and high income areas. So you get a community with higher income level, and they're more apt to have the resources to help manage newly planted trees. Whereas, in a community that's facing a lot of other economic challenges, it becomes harder.
Yes, absolutely. No, it's definitely, it's a huge thing. And it paints an interesting picture about what, where some of these trees might end up going. And I think we're going to get there a little bit later. But before we get into where they're going to end up, what I want to talk about is I want to try and paint a picture for folks, or get you to, of the scope of forests. Because I think there was some good imagery in the book that you provided kind of explaining where forests are at today as far as forest cover versus some relevant state and time in the past, like depending on what you had at the point of civilization, there was X number. And so, yeah, I just wanted to kind of paint a picture for people of the potential, right? So like how much forest we have now and how much more we could potentially support.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess we'll talk at the global level first. And it's important to think about like, what are we seeing as a global average, a global number versus what's happening in regional areas. But there were a couple studies I'll point out that have been influential in the scientific community's policy world, as well as gotten a lot of media coverage. In 2015, there was a study by a scientist named Tom Crowther. He was the lead author. He's at ETH Zurich. And he was at Yale at the time, and someone posed the question of like, how many trees do we actually have in the world? And he wasn't studying forests at all. I think he was working on fungi or something, but he thought it was a really cool question. And obviously fungi are connected to forests too.
Right.
And they came up with an answer, which was that, at the dawn of human civilization, we probably had about 6 trillion trees, and now we have about 3 trillion. So half of the level of what we used to have. Fast forward a few years later, and he was a senior author along with a lead scientist, Jean-Francois Bastin, in 2019, published an article in Science that was looking at the global potential. So now, when we consider, essentially they were kind of considering a world without us. Like if we take people out of the equation, where would trees go and where would they grow back, or where could they be restored?
Sure.
And the number they came up with was about 1 trillion. I think it was 1.2. And that we could have about 2.2 billion acres or almost 0.9 hectares, whichever metric you like, depending on where you are in the world.
Sure.
Let's try to be friendly to all today.
Yeah.
A very large area. And they also, made a calculation that those trees could sequester about 200 gigatons carbon dioxide, which is about 1/3 of the carbon burden of our atmosphere, what we've already put up there. Again, an enormous contribution to the problem at hand.
And that's on what's the rate of sequestration? Is that like 200 gigatons annually, or is that?
Good question. They don't actually say. I don't think it breaks down to. I don't think it breaks down to an annual. It was obviously in the models, but it's over a lifetime projection of some period. So that again has been a question. On at what rate can we get that? How fast could we get that? So it points out, that there is an enormous potential.
Right.
That article, particularly the 2019 one, 1 trillion trees, this 200 gigatons of carbon, was picked up by over 700 media outlets in the weeks that followed its publication. And that was due in part to some of the messaging and the ways in which messaging was perceived. Like people all of a sudden were taking the message of this is the single biggest thing we can do to combat climate change, which is not right. Like the single biggest thing we can do is reduce emissions first, and then let's talk about the other pieces.
Stop contributing to the problem is probably the biggest thing we could do. Yeah, that makes sense.
But it is a very, it's a fabulous course correcting tool, to consider alongside others. But that's what took off, and you had people across political spectrums, like executives at oil companies, standing up and announcing commitments to plant trees. And that was, again, also around the time that I started writing this book, because it was just taking off on so many levels.
Right.
But to your question of like what's happening in the state of the world's forests, so you can say we're at about half of the forest cover, we had before. Maybe we can get another 1 trillion trees back. But one of the big things to ask is like where are we losing forests and where are we gaining them? What kinds of forests are we losing and what kinds are we gaining? I had one ecologist, social scientist, so an interdisciplinary scientist like myself, tell me that until you show me we're not losing forest in the Amazon and the Congo and these tropical basins that are still experiencing rapid rates of deforestation, you can't say that there's a global transition going on.
Sure.
We may be gaining forest elsewhere, but they don't cancel each other out because they're different kinds of forests and they support different services. Big time. And, so even now, while I am uplifted by this movement, which continues to go on with planting efforts and interest to grow forests, we're still experiencing degradation in many parts of the world. And to that point, I'd also just say that, the forests that we have around the world are relatively intact, sequester about a third of our current global emissions of carbon dioxide a year. That is a service they are already providing. So I think 2023 was, 37 gigatons of carbon dioxide at a global level. And some estimates show about 12 or 13 of that being sequestered by trees. So let's keep that service going. Let's talk about, reduce emissions first, protect these existing stands second, and third, then where can we grow more?
Yes.
And yes, growing more could bring that up, maybe to a half, depending on a lot of different factors. So there's potential for us to do more work, but I think those other two steps, need to happen alongside it.
Apparently an entire book full of factors.
Totally. It's just like 300 pages of a long litany of factors enough.
It's totally. It was awesome. And you know what? Like, I think one really interesting. I like the big visuals for just like painting the picture and pointing out the importance, and then getting into the details. But I really appreciated the example of the Carboniferous period in the book. How during a time when the Earth had the most amount of oxygen and the most amount of forest cover, we are now burning those forests as coal. And that just paints such a crazy picture of how much carbon was locked up for how long. Yeah. And now, it paints a picture of the carbon imbalance that I think is hard to deny. Right. And I also like that I don't know much if it was you or I have a bunch of quotes written in my notes. I'm not sure if they were you or other people. They were probably mostly other people. But the final kind of statement was, trees got us into this. Perhaps they can get us out. And I like that. That was good.
Yeah. I mean, the Carboniferous is a really interesting period of time. And certainly I have a 6-year-old boy now, and he's, really obsessed with the Jurassic, as they all are for the dinosaurs. But he's now super into the Carboniferous and draws these like very interesting Dr. Seuss forests, from learning from me about this time. But, it's named carbo is coal, Latin fero to bear, to carry. So, this period in time was the coal-bearing years, and it started about 350 million years ago. Between 260 and 330 million years ago, it had the highest rate of global organic carbon burial that's occurred. And for about 9 million of those years, the single biggest contributor to what became coal was our trees from that time. They were these like copsid trees, and they have these giant stalks like asparagus, and they can grow over 100 feet tall and 6 feet wide at the base. And they look, the closest thing I can come up with is to a truffle tree from Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, I like that picture as well. That was good. Yeah.
But to me, it was, and it's a very short chapter in the book, but it was really fun to research and to learn about, because I feel like it is the proof positive that trees can sequester carbon for very long periods of time. I mean, it's so hard to even fathom 330 million years when we're talking about a crisis that's developed in 100, 150. What time frame do you want to put on it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And those trees, living relatives today, are these tiny like copsids that are like club mosses. So to me, it's also kind of funny that from an evolutionary perspective, we had these giant trees 330 million years ago, and now they're some of like the smallest, individuals that I measured when I was doing inventories and forest inventories.
Yeah. It's the size of your thumb. Yeah. That's hilarious. Yeah.
Something happened there.
Yeah, no kidding. The lack of oxygen, maybe something, whatever. Yeah. So I think it's important then to dive in. You were talking about making sure that we're putting the trees back in the right location, right? So you're saying like it's one thing. Okay, so we can put a bunch of trees in the northern hemisphere, but if we're losing a bunch in the center, in the Amazon and that kind of thing, that doesn't really help us. So we need to make sure that they're putting the same type of forest back in the right places for the right reasons. And I think it might be important to talk about on a global scale. So where is most of that forest loss happening?
Sure. Well, we're getting a lot of continued deforestation in tropical areas. The Amazon gets a lot of attention, Congo. There are countries that I mentioned earlier, like Suriname, they call them high forest, low deforestation countries. So these are countries that for some reason have, very high forest cover, but still are experiencing low rates of deforestation. And those are some of the kind of big blocks remaining.
Okay.
But then, you can think in boreal regions or areas where we could see more growth into the future. There's lots we can do in the U.S. to expand forests into areas that have had disturbances or loss in other regions. And I also like to think about the agroforestry part, because, again, like there's a tendency to think we should be restoring this ecosystem or this landscape of an ecosystem where there aren't people. But in reality, like people are integrated in these forests everywhere in the world, even the ones that people tend to call the most old growth, or remote or pristine. So I also think there's, a lot of potential for forests to be integrated into these other land use. And there's some interesting research showing, actually, Tom Crowther and some of his colleagues in his lab have a study coming out that's looking at kind of the sweet spot of where trees and farms coexist and the fact that trees can help with productivity. And there's other research showing this already, that they provide shade, they have a cooling effect, they can help retain moisture in an ecosystem. So you can get a farm to be more productive in some ways with some level of forest cover in there too.
Right. Yeah. And that was the vibe that I got. Again, it was when I mean that you wrote this well nuanced, well balanced, well considered, was that everything was on the table. Right. You were considering everything, and you're like, listen, let's be realistic about this. Where can we put trees? Where would they be helpful and not degrading to the situation, right? Like, you don't want to plant trees in the middle of a native grassland, because that's probably not where they're supposed to be. So we need to make sure that we're not just planting every field we see. We need to be smart about it and putting them where they can be sustained for long periods of time to sink that carbon, offer other biodiversity values and that kind of thing. But also, you talked about the need to have agroforestry as part of that as well, right? And there's different so I really appreciated that. And also the point to speak to your earlier point about integrating it into human life cycles, into human society, right? Is that even the term, primary or intact forests, right? Like, we assume that means that was without people. And as you know, that's not true, right? Like, there was Indigenous people around the world have been living in concert with those intact forests for time immemorial, right? So we know that the human beings in and of ourselves, we've been part of the ecology for a very long time. We're just, as a Western society, trying to refine that, figure that out in the new age, I guess, right? So I appreciated all of that breakdown and that nuance. It just makes for good reading. It makes for like well-considered discussion and dialogue, right?
Oh, thank you. And I definitely try to address these topics, through story. So I chose projects and people that I thought were exemplary of a larger topic, and hopefully that makes it to be a, enjoyable read. You get to know the characters and the places and the projects, but they're all speaking to some of the, controversial aspects and some of the larger lessons coming away from the book. I intentionally didn't go to Indigenous communities, in the Amazon, for example, or even really spend time in the American West. I felt like I didn't want to represent those stories or to take those stories. But I will say that, there's a number of points I make. Some of our best climate adapted management plans now are coming out of Indigenous knowledge and integrating Indigenous knowledge with how, land management happened and happens and still happens with, for example, like controlled fires. There's research in the Amazon, showing that some of the regions that are cared for by Indigenous people are having the best rates of, success in terms of stewardship and protecting those forests into the future. Maybe I'll just say that that those other cultures and communities are really the first of our tree keepers. Yeah,
for sure. No, I just love this. It's just good to mention and good to point out. And I totally agree with you, right? Those aren't our stories to tell, for sure. So So getting back to the trillion trees idea, right? So
Yeah.
we're trying to figure out how many trees we can reasonably get back on the landscape in a way that is beneficial to society, to the world, to the biodiversity crisis, to carbon sequestration, that kind of thing. We'll go with the 1 billion or the 1 trillion for now. So you broke down a lot of different places where these could end up, but I would like for you to describe them and kind of where you imagine. Obviously, you're not the czar of planting forests, and so you're not controlling it. But if you had control, if you could imagine where they would end up, where these forests should go, I want to discuss that a little bit so people can kind of imagine what we're talking about.
Sure. Well, I would say that every plant-covered continent has a opportunity here, and that it's really context dependent. And the other thing I want to avoid is I feel like there have been a country will say like, "This is my commitment. This is how many trees we want to get," or even at a global level, say 1 trillion, and then someone comes in from the outside, looks at a lot of remotely sensed data, and says this is where they should go. In reality, like where they should go is where they can be integrated into local land use and where people can support that into the future. So that could mean, areas in our urban communities that are laying fallow. And it was interesting to learn about, a movement to depave certain areas that are, there's nothing happening there. Why not make it a green space? Like, that's an opportunity. Yeah. If you're in an area, like I was in Panama, I spent some time on the Azuero Peninsula there. It has a really amazing forested area that's fragmented from cattle ranching. And that land is no longer as productive as it was. The dry season's longer. A lot of the cattle are stressed, very skinny. People in that area want and need another source of income. So, yes, while you could look at satellite imagery and say, could trees go there? The question is, does the community want it? And do people need it? And can they support it?
Yes.
And there, the answer was yes. It was really amazing to see a lot of different landowners coming together to reforest their land. They were, at the time I visited, signing up with contracts to receive carbon credits for the work that they were doing. And then there was also, a lot of other benefits coming into the community with alternative incomes, like women and families growing seedlings in their backyard and then selling those to the project. Mm-hmm. So we could look at every part of the world and say where they could go, but I also think that it's one of the key messages is where is it economically viable and socially viable and culturally viable. One of the other interesting studies that came out very towards the end of when I was writing, because Tom Crowther and Jean-Francois Baston's study of this global potential had been so controversial, they essentially got together, like 200 scientists who had some of them who had really critiqued it, to do another analysis and to run the data a number of different ways, Yeah. And the answer in terms of what the potential is for carbon sequestration actually ended up being about the same. It was kind of this big wave of consensus showing what we could get from these forests into the future. But one of the other interesting findings in that research was that they broke down where that could come from. Like, was it all tree planting? Was it all tree planting? No, about 60% of it was coming from growing the forests that we currently have. So forests around the world still have more potential to keep growing over their life. So if we keep them and we keep them growing, they'll contribute a lot to carbon sequestration. The other 40% was looking at creating new.
I see. That's interesting. That makes it's funny how every time you take a little step back from it, or a step closer in, I should say, and you nip away a little bit of that, it becomes that much more feasible. You're like, okay, that's all of a sudden we're getting closer and closer to something that like conceptually seems totally doable, right?
Yeah.
I think the point of the need for local support and like the right trees in the right place with the right support so that they last as long as they can is totally makes sense to me, right? It's the big thing. Because I even think about here in Canada, especially there's been quite a few research groups and a lot of Indigenous leaders even that have suggested that in Canada, at least in the prairie provinces and that kind of thing, our issue might not be that we have not enough trees. It's that we might have an overabundance of mature trees, almost a homogeneous carpet of trees as a result of colonization and fire suppression and all these things, right? And that we actually need more diversity of forests in order to be more resilient and get back to a place of where it supports maybe a higher level of biodiversity or whatever it might be. And that my point is not to say that we don't need to plant forests here, only that I know there's people that have a concern that we don't need more unmanaged or preserved forests that people aren't allowed to be into or to, to manage or steward. What we need is more forests that are integrated and more forests that are providing multiple values. And so I thought, yeah, that was an interesting point, right? Like a place in the tropics where there is deforestation and we can deforest, like that totally makes sense. And a place like in Canada, maybe it's more in the agricultural lands where same kind of thing, right? Where you're afforesting. But yeah, like you said, it needs local support. And I think that's the interesting point, is that it needs sustainability from all sides, not just plant a tree and leave it.
Yeah, and I think one of the other interesting things to look at has been the perception of the cost involved. There's a lot of $1 per tree marketing campaigns, or you'll buy some item and it says we planted a tree or 10 trees. From your purchase. Thank you very much. But a lot of those planting initiatives end up receiving funding from a number of different mechanisms. So maybe your money did go for the act of planting. But again, you always have to ask the question, what's going to keep those trees on the landscape, and where are the other economic incentives, or if they need, watering or other kinds of care in the years of establishment, how are you funding that? So one of the things I explore in the book and through various projects is, if we're going to continue to do this work into the future, how do we do it in a way that is using native species to the best of our ability and, restoring when we can in places to build, these functioning ecosystems, but also finding ways for that to be economically viable.
Yeah, totally. At the end of the day, it has to be economically viable. Otherwise, we can't expect anything to happen. Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. Yeah, I want to get into that. Before we get into the economics of it and the funding and where that stuff is coming from, I want to talk a little bit more about our relationship to these forests that we're going to try and plant and try and put on the landscape. And what is the perception in the research community as to what our relationship to these forests would be? Like, obviously, you've discussed the need to have local support there to, it might be to water the seedlings while they're establishing themselves, or it might be to do prescribed activity of one way or another. But what are we imagining as the long-term goal for these forests? Because I can think of a lot of different ways, right? Like there's preserves. We're we're going to plant them. We're going to make sure they grow, and we're going to not touch them, leave them alone forever. There's conservation. There's managing them specifically for maximizing carbon sequestration if the big worry is climate change, or any other, managing them for any other number of values, whether it be timber, biodiversity, or, avoiding catastrophic fire, or whatever it might be. I'm just wondering what the conversation and the research is around the future of those forests and what a relationship would be to them.
Yeah, I think it really goes back to the question of what is the forest you're growing. In an urban community, a forest can be defined by street trees. Sure. One of the places I researched was in England. This is a plantation of Paulownia, and this is a species that comes from China. It's now a hybrid. It's been bred as a hybrid. And this is an incredibly fast-growing species that is like the jack and the beanstalk of, carbon sequestering trees. Like, it works very quickly.
I was blown away to read that part. I was like, what is this tree? Like, is this made up?
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. And that, that tree, I think the estimates show an acre of Paulownia could be equivalent to taking 80 cars off the road per year. It's remarkable what it does in terms of carbon sequestration. But asking what our relationship to those trees is really different in the context. Our relationship to a street tree is really different than our relationship or the relationship of people living in and around some of these intact forests we've discussed. Or in that region, that area used to be farmed largely for root vegetables.
Okay.
And while some might say, like, what are we doing planting Paulownia on this farm? And that's not what grew in England.
Right.
Others would say, like, well, neither really did potatoes,
Those are South America.
So, why not, farm these trees for some carbon? So I guess rather than there being one answer, of what is our relationship to trees, I try to show a diversity of them in a lot of different places.
Yeah.
And knowing that if we are going to keep trees into the future, we're also going to need a diversity of relationships to different kinds of forests.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. Like we're talking about the global scale of forests. There's going to be a global diversity of forest types and forest relationships. And I think my point in asking that question was more, does the scientific community expect it to be this, like, let's plant these forests and leave them alone, let them sequester carbon, walk away? Or is it like, hey, let's plant these forests and have the normal amount of relationship and interaction and management or stewardship that we would have, as long as we can maintain the fact that those forests will remain forests, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think any project now that you're certifying for carbon should and usually does have a really rigorous plan to do that. So if you are, looking to grow a forest or looking to put carbon credits on it, part of that system requires, for good reason, there are really good checks over various points in time to ensure that those trees are still standing and that they're sequestering the carbon we think they are, and therefore it's okay to put a value on them, based on the price of carbon, based on the sale of those credits.
Yeah.
So I don't think, while someone might plant a tree and walk away and think, I hope it becomes a tree and we'll see what happens. The actual tree keepers are thinking more long term from the beginning.
Yeah.
And particularly when there's money or carbon trading involved too.
Mm-hmm. What role does, I think about in a world where we know we're only getting more and more people, demand for houses and that kind of thing is going up, and it feels like our demand for sustainable wood fiber is not going down really. What role does sustainable forest harvest in the truest sense have in this story of sequestering carbon for climate change? But does that fit into it?
One of the things I wanted to avoid was this sense that I wish, we could go back to everything that once was, and we should be rebuilding whole ecosystems everywhere. I think it would be really naive not to recognize there's lots of demand and need for wood in the world. And that said, I also think even, some of our forestry practices can support more biodiverse forests and more native species. In the UK, for example, the UK is, I think, number one or number two, in the world in terms of importing wood. So they're getting their wood from elsewhere. And so there's also a need to produce domestically. But there's interesting rules where when you're planting a timber forest, there is a percentage of that land, I think it's usually like 10 or 15%, that is also a native woodland. So a forestry company or that's managing the land largely for timber production is also supporting some portion of that land as a more diverse native woodlot. I think that's a really good example of continuing to meet the demand, but also planting species that will sequester carbon and maybe stay standing longer term and provide other benefits. It's an interesting model that I don't think everyone uses.
Totally. Well, and there's research out there that shows that it takes, I think it's 30 years after forest harvest for the carbon sequestered from that new forest to actually I think it's equal out to what was being pulled with the mature forest before. So it takes 30 years before you're equal again. And then everything past that 30 years is sequestering more. But then also there's the research about biodiversity, right? If the point is to sequester more carbon and to support more biodiversity and other values, then you're actually talking about you need to get to 80 years in temperate forests before you're actually getting to a place where biodiversity has been kind of maybe not maximized, but you know what I mean? It's been reached to a point of where there's a significant amount of it. And it's supporting other ecosystem services. So there's all these numbers, and in my mind, I imagine this like relationship where, yeah, like you said, we're planting these forests and we're managing them for all of these things as co-values, like not treating it as a woodlot so much, but treating it as a forest that we can manage for all the values equally as co-values, right? And wood is just one of those co-values, whether it's through selective harvesting or commercial thinning to try and create some other kind of habitat while also removing wood fiber. I feel like there's very creative and diverse ways where it doesn't have to be this woodlot idea where everything's planted in rows and we want to create a forest that's functional, not just sequestering carbon. So I just like the idea of being able to have these forests and be creative with them and use the management tools and our need for resources to be creative and to do new things and to try new things and to see how maybe we can change the way we relate to those things on a global scale, right? If we just think a little bit more about it and tinker with it a little bit more.
Yeah, and I saw that even in the Polonia project, which I kind of raised as an extreme, right? Like growing this species that's a hybrid from another region to sequester carbon at a really fast rate. Even that project was planting other species to create a diversity of species on the property. They had, they're trying to support pollinators, restore the soils. I think at the time they were looking to, find ways to facilitate bee pollination and honey products.
Yeah.
So anytime, I guess, to the timber or carbon, I think anytime you focus on one value and trying to optimize for just one, you can run the risk of degrading the others or maybe just some externalities or unexpected outcomes. So the more we can think in this, somewhat more holistic way,
totally,
in this, the better.
Absolutely.
Or if you're starting a project and thinking, okay, well, primary is carbon, let's also ask the question, what was here before? What could survive into the future? What other benefits could come if we started to diversify what we're planting or how we're using this land? And thinking about those, multiple values that you just mentioned.
Totally. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I think at the end of the day, we just got to start too, right? Like let's start planting these, and let's, like, in 5 years we'll have a different idea. We'll have different incentives. We'll have different perspectives. Like let's just start and begin, and we can always adjust course as time goes on. It's not like you plant a forest today and its future is set in stone, right? Like there's we're able to think and adapt and change as time goes on. So I guess my question was more just around I think including the whole suite of relationships to nature is, I think, part of the solution here, right? So it's, that's great. That's great. And I got that like from your book too, right? That you're like, everything's on the table. We need to be realistic, and there's nothing more realistic in our culture, right, than knowing that it needs to be economically viable, right? I
love that. I think the Society for Ecological Restoration has that really good, they call it this restoration continuum that's useful to guide thinking here. And it's the idea that there's this continuum of activities we can do in restoring a landscape. And on one end of the spectrum is simply avoiding negative outcomes or negative effects like pollution, for example. So you're doing something to mitigate those.
Sure.
And on the other end of the spectrum is fully restoring an ecosystem and its functioning, like that being the 5-star dream.
Yeah.
And it's not that we can do that in every place, but when you say every act falls on this continuum somewhere, and how can we keep inching closer to the higher end of the spectrum, you run the chance of delivering more biodiversity benefits, more climate
Yes.
benefits,
Yeah.
more human health and well-being benefits.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, it makes sense. Got to include the whole suite of values and just like think about all the options all at once. It's fascinating how complex it all gets to, as as your book makes very plainly clear, right? There's lots to consider, and there's lots of skepticism, and there's lots of potential and lots of excitement and lots of opportunity, and there's just I like how real it is though, right? Like you made sure that this was real, this was tangible, this was like functionally possible. So
I was going to say, I think one of the other big hopes I have for this book is that it inspires more action in a way, to make this work better into the future. I feel like oftentimes, to circle back to where we started, with these sexy headlines, plant trees, don't plant trees, like it works, it doesn't work. People like black and white. The gray is a little scary.
Yeah.
But I believe this work is important. I believe it will help make the planet more habitable into the future for a number of reasons, not just because of carbon. And that, by illuminating the complexities, we can kind of put values up and guardrails, if you will, that help guide this work into the future. And also that, points to the message that we can and we are all tree keepers in some way. And you don't have to think about just these far off intact forests. We can also think about the nature in our backyards and in our communities, the green spaces and forests and trees, and how to be better stewards of them in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I like that, right? Like making it real. I think that's the one thing too, is that in this, I have these discussions on the podcast about these big world-changing concepts and all this type of stuff, and everyone's like, "But how do I fit in? Like, what do I do?"
Yeah.
And it's like, well, the answer is you do what you can, where you can. And I had a whole episode just on, for lack of a better word, I'd say like rewilding your yard, right? Like planting native flowers and native grasses in your yard, or having just a pile of brush and crap in the back for insects and birds to nest in, or leaving the leaves on the lawn so the bees can nest or whatever over the winter time. And everything counts. I think all these small scale things, like everybody that puts a solar panel on their roof, that's helping, right? All these things are helping us be more sustainable, more thoughtful, more holistic. And the truth is, just do the little things that you can. And these big discussions are great, and they help move mountains as far as the nations are concerned and that kind of thing. But everybody can contribute, and that's clear, right? So that being said, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to point to, I'm thinking of a scientist I spoke with in Hawaii. His name is Camila Mora, and he was involved in a number of projects in Hawaii. He studies biodiversity and climate change. He's not a forest ecologist or a forester, but he's a citizen, too, who's concerned about climate change and really wanted to get involved in tree planting. And some of his projects, were critiqued in ways because of, low survival rates in the beginning, and they were learning by doing. And he was quite open and honest about some of these trees didn't survive. A lot of these trees didn't survive. And we worked hard, with a lot of volunteers and community coming together to help do it better, or try to do it better. Right. But one of the things he pointed out in an article he published was that there are over 2 billion acres of land that could be planted without conflicts with urban development or farming. The scale of the endeavor appears daunting, but equates to just 130 trees per person, or a 10-hour job for an average individual. And I don't know that we're all going to, manage 130 trees, but I like the message being, that what if we all just did, plant a few, and not just plant, but steward into the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. Everyone
it's not going to solve the climate crisis, but it's going to help us out,
Every little bit counts. Yeah. It's definitely not degrading anything or removing from society's values, right? Like it's definitely helping. Yeah. No, I think making it tangible, making it real is what empowers people, right? Like if you know that you can get involved in whatever local, I'm sure, every major metropolitan area now in North America, at least, is going to have one of these companies, these nonprofits that is, taking carbon credit money and planting forests somewhere, right? You can get involved in those things. They're out there. Do it in your local community, in your backyard, wherever. Yeah, it's totally doable. Yeah, I love that. I love making it tangible. It makes it justifiable.
Yeah, and I think there's also been, to point to your comment on carbon credits, they have gotten a lot of attention as a funding of these efforts, but they're really only funding a portion,
Yes.
probably a low one.
Yes.
And that, a lot of other funding mechanisms are helping to support this work. Public finance, which, needs to increase, donor money, and individuals playing a role too. But carbon credits are really just a piece of that. In the United States, under the Biden administration with the Inflation Reduction Act, there was about $1.5 billion that went to urban forestry. Really amazing to see, that amount of funding going towards, this issue of tree equity and in our urban areas. So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to see different kinds of investment across the board, because I think trees aren't really a partisan issue. People tend to care about trees, and we've been living in and around them for millennia. And the catch-all for doing something good is rooted in a general appreciation and somewhat innate, valuation of trees.
Yep. Trees are nice. It's pretty hard to find somebody that's just like, nah, screw trees. I don't want to. Doesn't really happen. Yeah. But that ties us well back into this idea of economy. Right. And I thought one thing, the idea that this all needs to be economically viable, it needs to be doable. And where's the funding coming from? How are we going to support this? We need the local support, all that. But to tie us to this conversation, I'm going to start with one of the quotes from your book. And you were talking about the World Economic Forum, the 2020 report that listed that, just to point out the importance of this again, half of the world's $44 trillion GDP is threatened by the loss and degradation of nature because human societies and economic activities fundamentally rely on biodiversity. That's such a powerful statement, and one that I think people in environmental world totally understand. It's not surprising, but when you can put it in a way that like that simple, you're like, oh, okay. So how do we? So speaking to that, you spoke a little bit about the different incentive structures that are happening and different funding structures that are happening. But can we break it down a little bit more? How are we going to do this? How are we going to pay for this? How are we going to make this happen from an economic standpoint? Where do you see the incentives coming from?
I mean, I do believe it requires to some extent, a major shift in the way in which we've valued nature, not just trees for their carbon, but the many services that nature provide. I talk a little bit about, a study from 1997. Robert Costanza and a number of authors put that together. And they were looking at trying to assign a value to nature services. And they had these kind of different categories, such as, nutrient cycling or water supply or pollination. And they put a dollar amount on that. At the time they came up with 16 trillion to 54 trillion, and that was quite a number of years ago. But now, fast forward, there are countries that are working to integrate natural capital and assess natural capital as part of their GDP. I would say, as a broad, sweeping comment, if you will, that, the majority of our environmental problems have come from the fact that we have treated nature as an externality. It has been an externality, or the state of our ecosystems has been. So, if you think about
very colonial mindset,
totally polluting a waterway and then realizing oh wait, that was our drinking water. If you start to value the service for what it does, then you need to put a dollar on it, in our system.
Yes.
In the system that we have. So I think carbon credits are just one of them. Here we are saying we want to increase carbon sequestration. We want to increase carbon removal. Let's put a dollar amount on carbon and measure it in a tree. Yeah. But, I think there is now a larger movement to do that on many other services that nature provides. And I'll admit too, like part of me sometimes feels like, oh my God, is this what we've come to? That we like, the only way to save nature is to put a dollar amount on it.
Yeah.
Or the only way to recognize like how critical it is to sustain life. But I actually feel optimistic about some of the leadership on, creating more of a nature positive economy. In the UK, I know there's some other credit programs underway, such as biodiversity credits and water credits. And that's not to say that we're going to treat them like offsets, like we can degrade here or trade it for biodiversity elsewhere, but as a way of like investing in those values and capturing them in the system.
I know what you mean by saying like, I can't believe we're at this place where I have to tell you what this is worth in order to point out how important it is. And I get that. I also, as I'm sure you do as well, like I can totally see the value in that. Like in a world where, the Kardashians reign supreme, right? And consumerism is the key. If you can point out to people and be like, listen, this is how this forest saves you money. This is what it's offering you. This is what it would cost you if this forest didn't exist, right? This is what it would cost on your healthcare because your air would be less clean or whatever. This is the cost on your heating bill, on your blah, 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 whatever it might be. I think as soon as, I think it's just a helpful tool because our brains, our society has forced us to really like, we value everything in dollars. So if we can value nature in dollars, all of a sudden it computes. Instead of us saying like, hey, this is really important. We should take care of this. We're like, oh, okay, but we don't really know how important. And then when you can put a dollar value to it, you're like, oh, I see. Okay. Like maybe you start to think about it a little bit more, but then you get into questions of how you computing that dollar value and is it accurate?
Totally.
And
is it
that's
accurate?
It gets down a rabbit hole. But I
mean, same thing with carbon. And a lot of people I interviewed, that are doing this work, they say, okay, we're looking at the above ground carbon and we're measuring this woody bowl, this trunk, but are we considering what's below? And there's certainly, a movement now and efforts underway where projects are considering what's happening below ground in terms of carbon sequestration. But obviously, like anytime you have a way to measure something, you're working to improve that. But it does make it more personal and real. I mean, I think about like a great example of honeybee populations. For ecologically, you could make all these arguments as to why they're essential for ecosystem functioning. And then, you say something like $15 billion a year in the United States of, agricultural products depend on that pollination service. And all of a sudden, like 50 billion makes you sit up a little differently. Like, all right, let's protect the honeybees.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
What do we need for the honeybees?
Yeah. That's what I mean. It gets all of a sudden, it grabs our attention and we go, oh, okay. So it's that important. I see. Now I get it. Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting one to say the least. So in the book, you were talking a lot about in all these commitments and all these pledges from companies that are starting to see these arguments. They're starting to want to get on board. They're starting to want to plant trees and make these commitments and these pledges to do some of this work, right? And so now we're talking about the payment mechanisms so that we can get this to not only get the trees in the ground, but get them supported locally and all that kind of thing. I'm not sure how to ask this question, but I'm trying to paint a picture of how big the gap is between the pledges, the commitments, the people in their offices that are going like, I want to do good, and then the actual happening. Like how big is that gap? And like how much space is there, and how do we actually get that ball rolling in a real way?
I haven't looked specifically with the Trillion Trees campaign, when you're speaking to the World Economics Forum's tracking of where like 1t.org is. But the numbers I've seen was a figure about 50 billion per year has been used to describe the finance gap for achieving the bond challenge, which is, restoring about these 350 million hectares of forest by 2030.
Okay.
I've also seen estimates of about 600 billion to address biodiversity loss in its entirety. So that's obviously taking a bigger, picture here beyond forests, but a lot of our forests support a biodiversity of life as well. So there's definitely a fair bit of overlap there.
Totally.
So there's a gap, somewhere between 50 billion and 600 billion, which is an enormous amount of money.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question moving forward. Public funds are committed to lots of different kinds of issues. How much could we get from public finance? The private sector, takes companies standing up and starting to do, what's called insetting as opposed to offsetting, like do more work in your own supply chain, to address carbon or these other environmental outcomes. And we're going to need some innovation for sure.
Yeah. There's lots of, this is kind of one of those new ideas, right? When we need to put a dollar value to it. We need to figure out how to get the ball rolling and how to move that money into the place where it needs to be to make the action happen. Right. It's, yeah. You know what, that number, the 50, somewhere between 50 to 600 billion is actually less than I probably would have thought. Like there's a organization here called Project Forest that they're a nonprofit and they're doing some of this stuff. They're getting private funding through, I think they got some through IKEA and some of these bigger, and they're just getting private funding to plant forests. And it's not just trees, right? They're planting shrubs, they're planting native grasses, they're planting a whole forest on these, degraded landscapes here close to, in Alberta. And Mike Toffin is the name of the guy who runs it. And I've had him on and he said that on average, when you average it all out, it can cost him up to $30 a tree.
Huh.
Just to get it in the ground, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm like, so when I think about that, if we want 1 trillion trees, and if it's $30 a tree, you're like, oh, that's 30 trillion. You're like, all of a sudden so like, I guess obviously that's Canada. It's expensive here. And there's a lot of, maybe there's places where it might be easier, right? But I'm kind of heartened by that number in a way.
I said that $30 per tree seems pretty high to me too, but it also influenced by, so many other factors of, what's the labor cost in that area? What's the travel involved? Is a forest naturally regenerating at all? You can see projects that are, down to the cents that are planting for a much lower cost. So,
well, yeah, you think about like forestry here in Alberta, same thing, right? Like they're paying whatever it is, 17 cents a tree or something to put them in the ground.
Is it really?
Right? But that's on a commercial scale. Like it's natural
scale,
landscapes with tree planters that are efficient, and they're putting 4,000 trees a day into the ground. Whereas the Project Forest one, it's like they get the corporate people to come out and do it themselves, right? So it's like it's this slow, it's like an experience, right? To get them out there, get them caring, get them feeling good about something that they've done. So it's not really set up to be really efficient, but it is set up for maximum value in capturing hearts and minds, right? And then making sure that landscape is sustainable for the long term. And so it's that's like the ultimate like version of like what it would cost, I think, if it's like you were to go all out and like in Canada where everything's expensive.
I've even heard higher than that, to be honest, for some landmark trees of what if you were thinking about bringing in a bigger tree into an urban center, you can get to really high cost. Arbor Day Foundation does some of that work in communities.
So we know we got to start getting creative with the economy, like whether it's credits or some kind of incentive for people to buy into biodiversity value or whatever it might be. But there's lots of creative economic people that can work that out. You and I don't need to do it. But I think the really interesting part is that local support. I want to talk about local support and like building that local workforce and those local stewards that can not just plant these forests, but maintain them over time and take care of them and ensure that this is supportive of local values as well as sustainable forests. So I kind of want to talk about, how do you imagine those things happening? Do you think that'll happen somewhat naturally? Do you think that's kind of a natural flow, or do you think there needs to be like a push to really get these local communities or support staff going?
I think it depends on the origins of the project, right? If you have a community that's really wanting a change in land use and is really wanting a different source of income, and there's an opportunity there, right, then that is coming from community in place. The likelihood of that working out is probably relatively high.
Sure.
my concern sometimes is when you have this kind of top-down decision of, here's a project where there should be trees. Now, how do we recruit local people to support this?
Yeah.
I think that's the wrong approach, and we need to have global targets for a lot of reasons. And global targets certainly help motivate larger funding mechanisms, policy changes, et cetera. But, the more this work can come from local communities and does come from local communities, the better. Restore is an interesting platform. We talked a little bit about a couple other places to poke around during this podcast, but Restore is one that Tom Crowther, the scientist, was also involved in the early start. But it's like a global tracking of restoration projects around the world, and not just carbon certified projects. And in fact, a very low portion of them, or low percentage of them, are certified. But if you hop on there, I find it super inspiring to look at, these thousands of projects across all different kinds of scale, where people are restoring lands and increasing tree cover in lots of different places. So I guess that's to say that maybe the best vision is we all become, tree keepers to some extent at whatever scale is possible. And like collectively, that kind of bottom up movement, if you will, although I kind of hate top down, bottom up is also really, part of this.
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah, having that local incentive and that local push going upwards makes, I could see how that would be more sustainable over a long term than having a corporation be like, hey, who are we going to get to do this? Because then it's that. Yeah,
and I'll totally point out, like, I don't want to be totally rosy about it. There's certainly been, I don't want to be totally Pollyanna about it. Like, there's certainly some situations where projects have, people have come in to a location and wanted to green it, and that project doesn't end up successful. There was a study in Detroit, Michigan, where community members were offered trees, and about a quarter of the people they surveyed didn't want them, partly because they felt like, this is a change in my, my perception of what the landscape is, so the change in my community. They were concerned about maintenance. And also there was, a sentiment of outsiders coming in telling me I should green my space,
Right.
And when I interviewed urban foresters about that, and asked people, like, are you seeing a lot of failed plantings? The answer today I saw was no, because I think there's a strong community involvement in a lot of different projects. But I remember one person citing, well, I remember one project, and you know what it was? It was a company that came in for a day, and they had their company employees plant these trees and leave. And so imagine if you're living in a community, like somebody shows up from a corporation, like, I don't know, I'm just imagining in my head, like hopping out of some white van or whatever, and like pretty much trees in the ground and leaving. That's really different than a community coming together and saying, like, here we have this block of land that's mostly cement and nobody does anything on it. Like, couldn't we make this a great green space?
Yes.
And let's do that.
Totally. The local movement thing totally makes sense. Yeah. I see how that could be more sustainable, and just those are the only issue with that is that we have to be lucky enough to find them, right? Like, I guess we got to be, it's like, if we're like, okay, I hope people are going to take it up. And I think you're right. It seems like there's a local push, right? It does seem like there's.
But that's also the exciting part of this movement, I think, is people coming together in a way that they haven't before, whether it's government setting top-down targets, companies putting forward money, or communities saying, like, we want trees. I think it requires an unprecedented level of collaboration across sectors and communities and cultures, which to me is exciting.
Yes, absolutely. No, big time. So what would you say is the biggest barrier to like, what are the commonalities that you see, the biggest barrier to getting these things to work, to be successful? Or is it just depend? It's totally changes based on the locality.
Yeah,
sometimes it's money.
I have a hard time answering because it's so context dependent.
Totally. That makes sense. That's an answer in and of itself.
I definitely feel like in a dream world, it would be great if there was more funding going towards restoring nature for its many services, which requires us valuing it in different ways. And we've already talked about that. But on a project-to-project level, I think it's really, really context dependent.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. it's a global scale, and so there's going to be global differences. Awesome. Well, I just want to repeat that I really appreciated the book. It was, again, very well researched. Obviously, you went deep and you made sure to leave no stone unturned. And I think it's a great read for anyone that wants to check it out. And you didn't come out and say it, but it was the gist of the book. But I'm going to ask you anyways. What do you think? Can we do it? Should we do it? Is this something that's feasible? Is this something we can do, that we should do?
I definitely think that we should continue doing this work, and I'd like to see the movement grow. I think there are problems, as there are in any kind of progress, but trees are essential to life and the functioning of our ecosystems, and critical for biodiversity, and critical to the health of our planet in many ways. So I would like to see a more forested planet, and I'd like to see that done in a way that engages local communities to the best of our ability and makes us all tree keepers to some extent.
Yeah, I love it. Awesome. Well, we can call it there. That was it was great. I again appreciate you taking the time to do this. Yeah. Thanks so much for taking the time. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. I learned a lot. So much to unpack there. And I really appreciated all of Lauren's hard work and dedication towards telling this story properly. Such a good job. Amazing. Get the book, Tree Keepers. It's available. Great read. You learn so much more, goes so much more in detail. And there's just so much there. So it's so rich and well written. The story's great. Go get it. Thanks again for checking it out. We'll catch you all next time. Take it easy.